The cameras were rolling, and Corporal James Whitfield, United States Army, had been standing in the dark behind the Family Feud stage curtain for 3 hours and 17 minutes when his mother, Beverly Whitfield, 58, walked to the podium during the third round and answered a question about what she missed most while her son was deployed, and said, without any prompting, with no idea that James was 8 feet behind her, "I miss the way he still hugs me like he's 7 years old. Every single time he comes home, no matter how long he's been gone. He hasn't changed that hug in 24 years. Corporal Whitfield heard this from behind the curtain. The production signal had not yet come. He could not move. He stood in the dark in his pressed dress uniform, with his jaw locked, and his hands at his sides, and his eyes closed, trying to hold himself together for approximately 40 more seconds, while his mother stood 8 feet away and described the one thing about him that had never changed since he was 7 years old. He did not manage it. He was not able to hold it together. Steve Harvey was watching a monitor backstage at that exact moment, with a camera that had been quietly trained on James behind the curtain for the past 47 minutes, and he saw Corporal Whitfield's face. He gave the signal himself, ahead of schedule, because he understood that 40 more seconds was not a thing that could be asked of a man who had just heard that. The curtain opened. It was a Thursday, April 3rd, in Atlanta, Georgia, and the Family Feud studio held 300 people who had no idea what was coming. Beverly Whitfield, a retired postal worker from Columbus, Georgia, had applied to Family Feud the previous June alongside her sister Patrice, her nephew Darnell, her daughter-in-law Shonda, and her granddaughter Aaliyah, who was 7 years old and had been told by her grandmother that they were going on a TV trip. Aaliyah had packed a small backpack for the occasion. It contained a stuffed rabbit named Theodore, 4 crayons, and a granola bar. She had the granola bar at 11 a.m. in the green room and had been saving Theodore for when things got important. She was sitting in the family row now with Theodore on her lap, very alert, in the way of a 7-year-old who has correctly assessed that something is happening that she has not been fully briefed on. What Beverly Whitfield did not know was that her son James had called the Family Feud production team from South Korea 14 months earlier. He had explained the situation in a single phone call. His mother did not know he was scheduled to rotate home. The Army had granted him a 30-day leave beginning April 1st. His commanding officer had helped him arrange for the return date to be kept from his family. James had asked the producers if he could come home on their stage. The producers had said yes, and then spent 14 months organizing a production around a secret that required perfect execution. The only family member who knew was Beverly's sister Patrice, who had been recruited into the conspiracy by James directly and who had maintained it, flawlessly, for 14 months, across twice-weekly phone calls with her sister, during which Beverly talked about James constantly. Patrice had responded every time with some version of, "He'll be home soon." Because he would be. James Whitfield had been in South Korea for 14 months. He was 31 years old. He had joined the Army at 19. He wrote in his original letter to the production team, because his mother had worked 2 jobs to raise him alone from the time he was 4 years old, after his father left, and the discipline and the values she had given him in those years had made him the person who was capable of joining. He had wanted to do something she could be proud of, and he had wanted to become the kind of man she had raised him to be. Beverly had worked the morning shift at the Columbus post office and a Friday and Saturday evening shift at a retail distribution center for the first 14 years of James's life. She had never missed a parent-teacher conference. She had attended every school event in a pressed shirt and a careful expression that said she had come directly from somewhere important. She had given James the impression, for those 14 years, that none of it was particularly difficult, which was itself a form of gift that James only understood the full value of later. He had written in his letter that he wanted to be behind the curtain before his mother arrived at the studio. He wanted to hear how she talked about him when she didn't know he was listening. "I've been away 14 months, he wrote. "I know she worries. I know she prays. I know she says things when I'm not there that she wouldn't say to my face because she doesn't want me to worry about her worrying. I want to hear it. Just once. That's the realest thing I will ever know about how she feels about me." The producers built a small observation space behind the stage curtain with a chair, a monitor feed, and a foam-lined panel to reduce sound. James arrived at 9:47 a.m. in his full dress uniform, every button fastened, every crease where it belonged. He sat in the chair in the dark. The monitor showed the stage, empty and lit. He had 3 hours and 17 minutes to wait. 3 hours and 17 minutes is a long time in the dark, long enough for everything to happen inside your head that you haven't let happen in 14 months, because there was a reason not to, a duty and a structure and a purpose that required the things inside your head to wait their turn. Now they did not have to wait. James sat in the chair in the produced silence of the Family Feud backstage space and thought about the things he had not thought about during deployment. The smell of his mother's kitchen. The sound of the neighborhood at 7 a.m. On a Saturday, the specific noise of a screen door that has needed repair for 10 years and has not been repaired because it makes the sound it makes. And that sound means home. He thought about the last time he had heard that door. He thought about the look on his mother's face when he left, which she had arranged into calm, because she was Beverly Whitfield, and she did not let James see anything she could spare him from seeing. He thought about how long it had taken him, at 31 years old, to understand that the arranging of her face like that every time he left was itself the most expensive thing she had ever given him. Beverly and the family arrived at 12:15. Aaliyah was wearing a yellow dress. Beverly was wearing a yellow blazer she had purchased specifically for this day, which she had told Patrice about on the phone, and which Patrice had told James about, and which James had found quietly devastating in a way he had not predicted. He watched his mother walk into the studio on the monitor. He put his hand over his mouth. What the studio audience did not know, what Beverly had told Patrice, and what Patrice had told James, and what James had turned over in his mind during the 3 hours and 17 minutes in the dark, was what Beverly's 6 a.m. prayer actually sounded like. Beverly had described it to Patrice once, on one of the twice-weekly calls, in the offhand way people describe the most serious things in their lives. She knelt beside her bed. She said the same prayer she had said every morning since James joined up at 19, and she said it to the window, because the window faced east, and Korea was east, and she figured the direction probably helped. She had a small framed photograph of James on the windowsill. Army dress uniform, the one from his commissioning. She looked at the photo while she prayed. She had been doing this for 12 years. The frame was worn at the bottom corners from being moved and replaced so many times that the finish had worn down to bare wood. She didn't notice anymore. It was just what the frame looked like. Beverly was warm and easy and funny with Steve in the opening introduction. Steve asked about James, and Beverly said he was in South Korea and that she prayed for him every morning at 6 a.m. because she figured that was 7 p.m. in Korea, and she liked to think God's line was a little shorter at that hour. Steve laughed. 300 people laughed. Behind the curtain, James Whitfield pressed his fist to his mouth and closed his eyes. The game went warmly through 2 full rounds. Beverly answered with the particular clarity of a woman who has been underestimated her entire life and has developed, from that experience, a very efficient relationship with being correct. She scored on 2 questions. She joked with Steve between answers. The audience had claimed her as their own within 15 minutes, and then, Beverly said what she said about the hug. Steve Harvey's signal came early. The curtain opened. Beverly Whitfield turned. She saw her son. She saw James standing there in his dress uniform, perfectly pressed, perfectly present, 8 feet away from where she was standing, and clearly not in South Korea. Beverly Whitfield's knees gave out. Not suddenly, not with drama, simply, they bent. And she went down. And James was already moving, 5 steps across the stage in under 2 seconds, and he caught her by the arm before she reached the floor. She grabbed the front of his uniform jacket with both hands and pressed her face into his chest. James stood straight, the posture that had been trained into him, the bearing that doesn't leave even when everything else is happening, except that his face was completely undone, and he was holding his mother the same way she had said he'd held her since he was 7 years old, and he was not letting go. 300 people stopped breathing at the same moment. The studio fell completely silent. Even the crew members had stopped what they were doing. Hardened television professionals were looking at the floor. The sound technician had taken off his headphones. Not the usual game show pause. Something different. Something that had its own weight. Steve Harvey had to turn away from the cameras. He walked to the far edge of the stage and stood there with his back to the room, pressing his handkerchief to his face. He was not performing. His shoulders were moving. He stood there for nearly a minute. Aaliyah, 7 years old, was watching all of this from the family row with Theodore the rabbit in her lap and enormous, attentive eyes. She watched her grandmother. She watched her uncle. She watched Steve Harvey's back. Then she said, clearly enough for the floor microphone to catch it, "Are you sad, Mr. Steve?" The audience laughed through their tears. The particular sound of a room that has been held in grief and has been unexpectedly offered a breath. Steve turned around. His eyes were red. He looked at Aaliyah for a moment. He said, "Baby girl, I am the kind of sad that comes from seeing something so beautiful it hurts a little bit." Aaliyah considered this. She seemed to find it a reasonable explanation. She looked back at her grandmother and her uncle. She petted Theodore once, contemplatively. Steve walked back to the center of the stage. Beverly and James were still holding each other. He gave them 3 full minutes, not edited, not cut, not filled with narration, that the producers aired exactly as they happened. The full, uninterrupted silence and weight of a mother holding a son she had not touched in 14 months. Then Steve moved gently toward them and said, "James, I know you have been gone a long time. And I know your mama has been praying at 6 a.m. every morning because she figured the line was shorter at that hour." James looked at Steve with a short, surprised laugh because he had not known Steve had been listening that carefully to that part. "I need to say something to you," Steve said. "My mother worked herself down to nothing for me. She did things I only understood much later. You understood early enough to make the choices you made with your life. That's not a common thing. That's a rare and specific thing." He held up his hand. He pulled out his phone. Something hosts never do during tapings. A producer stepped forward from stage left. Steve turned to the producer and shook his head once, with the calm authority of a man who has already decided. And the producer stopped. He dialed. On speaker. He said, "James Whitfield. Corporal, United States Army, 14 months deployed to South Korea. I want to set up an education scholarship fund. Name it the Beverly Whitfield Service Family Scholarship. Any child of an active duty parent who qualifies for higher education support. Seed it with $100,000 from my account. I'll add more when I know more about the structure." The line confirmed. Steve put the phone away. The audience had been standing for 4 minutes. He turned to the opposing family, the Coleman family from Atlanta, who had been watching all of this from the other side of the stage with a stillness that had its own kind of dignity. The stillness of people who understand they are in the presence of something that requires nothing from them except to bear witness gracefully. Before Steve could speak, the Coleman family captain, a man named Terrence Coleman, raised his hand. "We forfeit," Terrence said. "Whatever the prize is, give it to them. That is not a close decision for us." Steve looked at Terrence for a moment. Then he said, "Terrence Coleman, you are a good man." Terrence shrugged. "I got my family at home," he said. "These folks just got their soldier back. We already won." Steve gave the Coleman family the full runners-up prize from his own pocket. When the episode aired 9 weeks later, the curtain opening became the most watched military homecoming moment in the history of television game shows. The clip was viewed 225 million times in the first month. The clip of Aaliyah asking, "Are you sad, Mr. Steve?" was shared separately across social media and viewed an additional 90 million times in the first 2 weeks. The hashtag 7yearsoldhug trended for 8 consecutive days. A military family support organization used both clips in its annual awareness campaign and reported a 340% increase in donation activity in the 48 hours following peak circulation. The Beverly Whitfield Service Family Scholarship dispersed its first awards 8 months after the taping. The initial cohort was 14 children of active duty service members, each receiving full support for a year of higher education. The scholarship committee, which James helped form, required 1 essay from each applicant. Not about their academic record, not about their career goals, but about one thing their parent had done for them during a deployment that the applicant had only understood the full value of later. The committee read each essay before the selection panel. James read them himself in a single sitting on a Saturday morning in his apartment with his door closed. He sat for an hour afterward. Then he called his mother. She answered on the first ring. 3 months after the taping, Beverly Whitfield stopped praying at 6 a.m. Not because she stopped praying, because she no longer needed to calculate the time difference. James was home. He had accepted a position with the Army National Guard that kept him stateside. He still hugs her the same way he has since he was 7 years old. He has not been asked to change it. A year after the episode, Aaliyah started 2nd grade and wrote a class essay about the most important things she had learned that year. Her teacher sent a copy home to Beverly. The essay said, "I learned that sad can be beautiful. Mr. Steve told me so. He said when something hurts a little because it is beautiful, that is the best kind of sad." I thought about it, and I think that is right. Beverly has the essay framed. It hangs above her kitchen table. She sees it every morning at 6 o'clock. If James Whitfield's homecoming and his mother's 24-year hug reached something in you that you were not expecting, subscribe to this channel and hit the thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who has a soldier, a first responder, a parent, or anyone they love who is far away right now. Have you ever heard someone describe what they love about you before they knew you were listening? Tell us your story in the comments. And ring that notification bell, because more stories about the people who come home and the people who counted every day until they did are coming every single week.